Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. My name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian Woody Holton. Woody is currently professor of history at the University of South Carolina, and after receiving his BA in English from the University of Virginia and his PhD in history from Duke University, Woody was an assistant professor, then full professor of history at the University of Richmond. He's the author of numerous books about the American Revolution period, including Abigail Adams, that we'll be talking about today, Black Americans in the Revolutionary Era, A Brief History with Documents, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, and Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia. Woody's most recent book is Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. Well, Woody, let's talk first about Unruly Americans and the Origin of the Constitution.
I apologize for moving around a little bit. I had to get adjusted to this setup. I'm at the British Library in London having a great time, but it's not all good Wi-Fi, but I think we're okay. So thank you for the welcome, and thanks for having me on.
Okay, super. All right. Well, Woody, let's talk about Unruly Americans and the origin of the Constitution. First of all, there's so many books that are being written about the origin of the Constitution, even now as we speak in 2024. What inspired you to write that particular book about Unruly Americans with the emphasis on that and the origins of the Constitution?
Because we have all these giants who attended the Constitutional Convention, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Washington, that it's easy to get focused on their roles, and their roles were crucial. But it turns out that there was a historian now deceased named Alfred Young who referred to the ordinary people as the ghosts of the Constitutional Convention. That is, they weren't there in person, but they still managed to have an influence. And I was really persuaded of that, and wanted to see what people like Professor Young were talking about. I then read a book by Charles Beard called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And he said the founding fathers, he wrote it during the sort of muckraking era of it came out in 1913. And he said, he basically did a muckraking job on the founding fathers, saying, oh, they were just trying to line their own pockets. And that was intriguing. It didn't seem right, but it was worth checking out. And I ended up agreeing and disagreeing with Charles Beard, agreeing that there were economic motives for the Constitution, but it wasn't really the crass economic motives of, he'd said that the guys pushing the Constitution had government bonds and they wanted a federal government with taxing power so it could extract money from taxpayers and pay them. And I don't think it was that cut and dried at all, but I do think there was a strong economic motive, and that is that the country was in a terrible recession right after the Revolutionary War. That's often the case, that wars are followed by recessions. Even World War II, we think of the big boom, the baby boom, and everybody's buying a car with their money saved up from while they're off as soldiers or while mom was being Rosie the Riveter. But even World War II had a brief recession after. That's pretty common. Anyway, there was this terrible recession, and people like Washington and Madison and Alexander Hamilton had a kind of interesting interpretation of that recession, and they believed the recession was a result of excess democracy. In fact, that's the phrase that Hamilton used at the convention to describe the problem they were there to fight: excess of democracy. And actually, he wasn't even the first person to use it. A guy named Elbridge Gerry, he's the one for whom gerrymandering is named. One of the three people ended up not signing the Constitution that was at the convention. And so I think that phrase, excess of democracy, really sums up my book, because it was said at the convention, both by the guy who ended up opposing it and by the guy who wrote most of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton. And so what did they mean when they said there was an excess of democracy? Well, their feeling was, okay, it was good to get rid of the king, good to get rid of the House of Lords, but like a pendulum, you can swing too far the other way. And you and I can imagine that. Imagine if we had to vote if the people, if we had a true democracy, we're a republic, not a democracy. If we were a true republic and we had to vote on the name of every, every voter had to vote on the name of every hospital and every post office. You could theoretically do that with computers now, but it would be tedious. No one would do it, and I wouldn't know what was a good name for a post office anyway. So, but that's what they believed, is that the state legislatures, and remember, when we got out from under Great Britain, we didn't become a new nation. We became 13 new nations.
Right.
And so they were the ones who had the power, and they were quite democratic, certainly compared to what the Constitution would do. For instance, in every state except mine, South Carolina, where I live now and teach at the University of South Carolina, as you said, every other state, elections were at least every year. In Connecticut, they were twice a year. And even in South Carolina, it was every 2 years. And what annual elections do is hold representatives accountable, because if you do something bad, even people have short memories. They're going to remember for a year and vote you out of office. I don't take a position on this in the book, but a lot of people would make a case we should have annual elections. But the people who wrote the Constitution believed the opposite of that the state legislatures were, well, here's one way to put it. The legislators, the members of the legislatures were responsive to what their voters wanted, and that prevented them from being responsible. And even I, as somebody who tends to think of himself as an advocate for democracy, even I admit sometimes the people ask for stupid stuff. And the founding fathers definitely thought that. Now, they didn't all go to college. Washington certainly didn't have the chance to, but they did think of themselves as the more educated, responsible group. And of course, Washington went to the best college of all, which was 7 years in war, and he had that experience. And they believed, and they didn't, I don't think they felt really elitist about this, but they believed they knew better than the average person. The people like them knew better than the average person. Well, what I compare it to, my kids are teenagers now, but back when they were small children, they'd come home from Halloween night, and we wouldn't let them eat all of their candy that night. My wife, Gretchen, and I would take that candy and put it on the highest shelf in the kitchen for their own good. And how do I mean that analogy? That's what the Constitution does. It replaces the state legislatures, not in every way, but in the two most important things that governments do, other than go to war. Two most important things are levy taxes to pay for that last war, and control the money supply, the whole debtor-creditor relationship. And those, at least you may not agree, those are the two most important peacetime things, but they thought they were. And so the people who wrote the Constitution took those two powers away from the states and gave them to the national government, a new national government that would be much less responsive to the people. So for example, now I've got a brother-in-law who thinks this is a pretty good idea, but senators get to stay in for 6 years. And that means you can do something that the voters in your district don't like in your first or even second year in the Senate, and they'll totally have moved on by the time you're up for re-election. And the president, of course, is elected every 4 years. That seems sometimes too often because they start running, halfway into the previous term. But that's a lot more often than than most of the governors were chosen for. And of course, neither the Senate nor the president was chosen directly by the voters up until 1911, I think it was. The state legislatures chose the voters. chose the senators. And of course, it's still the case that we don't elect the president directly. And it's kind of interesting to think, you might like this, you might not like this, probably depends on whether you're red or blue, but in this century, we've had four people come to the White House, and two of them came without the majority support of the voters. They won with the Electoral College, so those were legitimate elections, but you can't call it democratic. And the founders didn't want it to be democratic. They created the Electoral College for a bunch of reasons. It was to give a little boost to the smaller states so they wouldn't be ignored. But one of the reasons was the electors would be these educated people. So if the voters did something stupid, like we used to, I don't know if you did this in high school, but we'd all vote for Mickey Mouse for school president, this council president. And that's all very silly and fun. But, at some point, if the voters vote for Mickey Mouse, then you have to have these educated, smart people come along and do the responsible thing. And that's how the Electoral College was conceived. And then if they screw up, you've got the Supreme Court, which is, it's triply insulated from the people because it's chosen by the president, not the people. And he's not chosen by the people. It's all been he so far. And he's chosen by the electors. And actually, in many states, at first, the presidential electors were not even chosen by the people. They were chosen by the state legislatures, which in turn were chosen by the people. So that kind of, I wish I had that kind of insulation in my house when I have to pay a air conditioning bill in South Carolina in August. That's a lot of insulation. Oh, of course, I forgot to mention those Supreme Court justices have life terms unless they really screw up and get impeached, and that's very rare. Right. And this was all putting the cookie jar or the Halloween candy jar on the tip top shelf where the kiddos couldn't get to it. And not because we don't like the kids, but because we do like them and we don't want them to make the mistake of adopting irresponsible legislation.
Right. Well, we should talk sometime about in the future about the Electoral College. I mean, that's an intense debate. Seems like it certainly comes up every 4 years anyway in the presidential election period. So, and it's becoming increasingly more important as we continue to move on, given the last several presidential elections or so. Well, most folks about the constitutional process ignore economics as a major factor, and I find this is what to me is unique about your book. Not only about the American Revolution, but in establishing our first form of government, under the Articles of Confederation, which was our first Constitution. Can you walk us through how Unruly Americans in particular, perhaps not the names of the day, the figureheads, but how they had a significant impact on what became our current Constitution? How did the Unruly...
Absolutely. Because the one thing the ordinary people agreed with the elites about was that there was a recession. But they disagreed about why there was a recession. They had almost the opposite interpretation of why there was a recession, because I said that one thing the elites believed the state legislatures were doing wrong was not raising enough money from taxpayers to pay off the war bonds that had financed the war and which had been bought up by speculators. And so one of the big critiques of the state legislators that came from elites was, you guys have to raise taxes. Your taxes are way too low because you got to get up the money to pay off these bonds. And again, there were some greedy people who owned bond themselves, and that's why they wanted those high taxes so they could get their money and go. But there were also people like Madison who didn't own bonds. He still wanted the bondholders to be paid off because that's how you establish the federal government's credit rating. And that's the thing that Alexander Hamilton correctly gets credit for. The federal government at the time the Constitution was adopted was essentially bankrupt. And, within a few years, it had a sound credit rating. And that from the fact that people were willing to lend, Dutch bankers, for instance, were willing to lend our government money at like 4% interest. So, pretty low interest rate. And that's a good index of your credit. We don't really need these credit rating agencies. Just ask me how much my bank is charging me for my loan, and you'll know if I'm a good credit risk or not. Anyway, the framers really wrote the Constitution for reasons like that, to give both the federal government a good credit rating and to give ordinary people a good credit rating. And here's where you asked the economic question, and I'm going to get back to the Unruly Americans that you also asked about, but here's my answer to the economic question. And it's a funny thing about James Madison. Remember I said that a lot of people Charles Beard and a lot of others think that the reason the people who wrote the Constitution did so was that they were creditors trying to collect the money that was owed to them. Well, Madison was almost the opposite of that. Now, he wasn't a debtor exactly, but he wanted to be a debtor. He was still living in his parents' basement at the age of 36, something that I hope neither of my kids did. I won't comment if I spent much time in my parents' basement when I was 36. I was a bit of a late starter myself, but my point is, now where that basement was a pretty, if you've been to Montpelier, that's not a bad place to live in the basement though, right. And he wasn't really in the basement. But my point is that he wanted to go set up on his own. And what does every business need to get started? Obviously you need the entrepreneur, and he was that. He wanted to go into land speculation, got good advice on that from the expert George Washington. So he was going to buy Western land and chop it up into small parcels and sell it off and make a huge profit. So you need an entrepreneur, but what else do you need if you're going to be a good capitalist? Answer my question like a good student, Randy. What does that capitalist need to get going?
Initial startup money.
Exactly. And that's what Madison didn't have, because his dad was still alive and his dad was going to leave him all this great stuff when he died, but he might not die anytime soon. Madison didn't want him to die soon, didn't want to wait till he did. So he needed capital, he needed cash, and nobody would lend him money. And he finally wrote his friend Jefferson, and Jefferson said, "Can you borrow money from the rich people over there in Paris? All those French ladies, you're charming. A lot of them are filthy rich." And Jefferson wrote back saying, "Look, the Continental Congress can't even borrow money in Paris anymore. They won't lend money either to the American government or to private Americans." And this is because I mentioned that the state legislatures were supposedly adopting really irresponsible laws, like the equivalent of me letting my kids eat all the Halloween candy on Halloween night. Among those irresponsible laws were laws that, for instance, if I owed you $100 and I'm supposed to pay you in 2024, this law would say, well, pay him $10 a year for each of the next 10 years. And frankly, Randy, I think that's a good idea, since I'm the one that owes the money, but you don't.
Right.
The contract says pay right away. And the state legislatures let people do, my state, South Carolina, did installments. Others allowed you to pay off with property. If there's no cash available, which there was none during this recession, you could pay off with property, which again is easy on the debtor, bad on the person who gets stuck with some broken down horse instead of the $100 that he lent out, and so forth. So I know this is complicated, but the state legislatures had, in the eyes of the founding fathers, adopted laws that were good for the farmer majority who owed money, but they had the bad long-term effect of making people who had money unwilling to lend it. And Madison was an example of that. He couldn't get anybody to lend him a dime. And so here's my sort of ironic economic interpretation of the Constitution, is that Madison's the guy who wrote it. And he wrote it because he wanted to regain the right to be sued. Not to sue, but be sued, because going back to that $100 that you lent me, you haven't forgotten, I'm sure. If you can sue me to get it back, then you'll be willing to lend me money in the future, because there's that final backstop. And so I explain this to students as, I have still $100,000 on my house, and I'd love it if the government would pass a law saying, oh, no one has to pay back their mortgage. That's a $100,000 profit from me. But suppose at the age of 64, I have 4 more kids and we need a bigger house. No one's going to lend me money if that $100,000 that's a gift to me is a theft from them. So that's what Madison wants. He wants, and actually the most popular clause in the Constitution at the time it was written. Right now, we'd probably choose something from the Bill of Rights, but remember, the original Constitution didn't have the Bill of Rights, just the original 7 articles. And out of all of that, the clause that got quoted and praised the most was Article 1, Section 10, very obscure today, except when I say contracts clause. You've heard of the contracts clause. It says the state can't impair the obligation of contracts. So I'm the debtor, you're the creditor. I can't pay you back in 10 installments. I can't pay you back with a broken down horse. I can't in any of these other ways. I got to pay you back with real money, which in those days meant gold and silver. So that's the economic motive that people like Madison have to make America safe for investment. But I do want to get the farmer side. You see what I mean? The people would be willing to lend both to the American government or to private Americans. And now I do want to get the farmers back in there, because they agree there's a recession, but they don't agree that the state governments are going too easy on debtors. They want the states to go even easier on debtors, and especially they want the states to go easier on taxpayers, because there's this huge government debt that's got to be paid back. And I told you, the people like Madison and Washington, the elites, wanted high taxes, and they didn't think the taxes that got adopted were high enough, but ordinary people thought they were too high. And here's where I really side with those ordinary people, because here's one of the great ironies of the revolution. The American revolutionaries rebelled against many things, but especially taxation without representation, right? the one phrase we all remember from high school,
Right.
taxation or earlier,
Right.
taxation without representation. Well, what's the first thing, once they got representatives of their own that they did elect, what did those representatives do? They adopted taxes that were about 3 times higher than the British had ever charged. And so I think about that in today's terms. You know, we're recording this a month after, not even a month after tax day. Yet it's always painful for me to pay my taxes. But imagine if my taxes tripled.
Yeah.
That would not only sink me, I'd be homeless in a week if I had to pay my triple what I now pay in taxes.
Yeah.
And carless and everything. I'd sell everything just to pay my taxes. And that's what was being done to the farmer. The states were going too fast in trying to liquidate this debt. And they were probably being too nice to these speculators, because the speculators had bought the debt up at 10 cents on the dollar, and they were paid back at $1 on the dollar. So they made a 900% profit, a ridiculously large windfall. And so even Madison, ironically, is somebody who was an advocate for the speculators a couple of years later, says, you know, this has gone a little too far. Why don't we have the speculators who bought up the bonds split the profits with the soldiers who initially earned the money, and then sold the bonds off because they needed cash to survive, sold them off at 10 cents on the dollar. So there's an agreement that there was a recession, but one side, the elites like Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Washington, they say the way out of the recession is to crack down on taxpayers, and that way we can pay off the bonds and restore the government's credit rating, and also crack down on debtors, people who owe money, make them pay their money back. And that way, the people who have money will be willing to lend in the future. That's one side of the story. The other side of the story comes from people like Daniel Shays. And finally, we get to answer your question about Unruly. They started rebellions. Its most famous of them all is Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. But I'm originally a Virginian, and not too far from where I grew up in Roanoke, Adonijah Matthews led a rebellion in what's now actually West Virginia, of people opposing the tax that the state legislature of Virginia, the House of Delegates, had levied to pay off Virginia's war bonds. And so you get these rebellions in almost every state. And so yet another motive for and they succeeded. The rebellions often succeeded in getting the state legislature to ease off on taxpayers and ease off on people in debt. And that's what the Constitution does, is prevents the states from easing up on taxpayers and debtors. It puts that cookie jar way up there where they can't get to it. And so there's a recession. There's two completely contrary solutions to the recession, but the solution embodied in the Constitution by the people who wrote it, Washington and Madison and the rest, that one won out, and the farmers' view just got crushed. And so that, I guess I could have answered your question a long time ago by just saying the main thing I wanted to say was that there were two sides to the story, really more than two sides, because once the Constitution was adopted, you get a whole new debate where the farmers are kind of out of it. But the debate is between the Federalists, who like the Constitution as it is, and the Anti-Federalists, who want to amend it. And it ended up getting those amendments, those first 10, which are the most popular part of the Constitution today, that is the Bill of Rights. And so really you might say there's 3 or 4 sides to the argument.
Sure. When I think of economics, though, the thing that really comes to mind is something that you won't even find in the textbooks, and that's Hamilton's bold plan of assumption. Now, most Americans simply, that goes in one ear and out the other, and they don't know what we're talking about when we mention assumption. I think it really kind of laid the groundwork for a very strong Constitution. Would you address assumption briefly and explain to the viewers and listeners what assumption was?
Yeah. So the short version of assumption is, many people have the assumption that Washington naturally became the capital of our country, but actually Washington became the capital as part of a deal that resulted in the actual assumption. And the actual assumption was the federal government assumed the state's debts. So my son who doesn't do this, but soon, the moment he turns 18, goes out to Las Vegas and sells his car and loses $10,000 at the craps table, and he needs money to go back to school and get an education. So Gretchen and I assume his debt and say, we're gonna pay your debt off for you.
Right.
Or maybe there's people watching who've paid off someone else's debt or had that done for them. Well, that's what Hamilton proposed to have the federal government do. The Revolutionary War was paid for by the Continental Congress, but also by the states. Basically, there was a point where, I mean, they were always both paying for it, but there was a point where the federal government, as I mentioned, went bankrupt, and the army still needed to be paid and fed, and so it told the states, you do it. And so the states took over that responsibility, in the course of which they ran up huge debts as well. So we came out of the war not with one huge government debt like the United States has today, but with 14 huge government debts. The Congress's debt and each of the 13 states had theirs as well. And so in the same way that everyone who supported the Constitution trusted the federal government because it's so undemocratic in the ways I mentioned, in the same way that all the supporters of the Constitution trusted the federal government to pay back taxes, to levy high taxes and pay off the bonds, Hamilton trusted the federal government to pay off the state bonds more than he trusted the states to do it. And again, if we go back to this fantasy of my son out there in Las Vegas, that would be correct. Trust me for paying off my son's debt, because I could come up with 10 grand and he's just lost everything at the craps table. He can't. Do you see what I mean? And so that's one reason Hamilton wanted the federal government to do it. The other reason was he was just a big federal government guy. And he didn't like the states. He thought they were too provincial and narrow-minded, too democratic, and so forth. And so he wanted, you would call him a deep state actor today. And it does surprise me that a lot of my conservative friends, I know you try not to talk politics, and we won't, but it is an interesting thing to see how many conservatives have embraced Hamilton, because he's a big government guy, and he's specifically a big government guy. He wants the big government levying a lot of taxes and spending a lot of money, and he wants a big military, of course. But part of the reason he wants the power to be he's totally against states' rights. The reason that concept didn't even exist, and he wanted all the power to flow away from the states and up to the federal government because the states were too democratic. So to me, that's not a great model for my modern conservative friends, but a lot of them embrace it, maybe because of the play or whatever it was.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you talking about the assumption. I just think it goes unnoticed in many respects, and you certainly don't find a discussion of it, even when they don't even talk about how the deal between Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton in terms of creating Washington, D.C. and carving that out. Well,
I alluded to that, but I'm glad you made that up, because there were these two fights. Where are we going to locate the capital? Is it going to be up north or down south? And it's this other debate was going on, because most of the bonds were held by Northerners. South Carolina was one exception. There were a bunch of bondholders there too, but generally we can oversimplify by saying most of the bondholders who own those state bonds, they even owned Virginia bonds and Georgia bonds. They'd come down here and bought up the bonds when they could still get them cheap. And now they wanted to be paid back at face value. And so in general, you had Southerners opposed to the federal government assuming the state debts. And you had Northerners supporting it because they would profit from it directly, and as would their whole economies of their states. So you had a North-South battle there, and this other North-South battle over where you're going to locate the capital. And you got to give them credit. I'm not sure I like either of these solutions, but because I think it'd be cool if the capital rotated. But anyway, they made a compromise. The South gave up enough votes to pass assumption in return for the North government giving up enough votes for the South to get the capital below the Mason-Dixon line, as you know, on both sides of Potomac at the time.
Right, absolutely. Well, you've covered a tremendous amount of material here in a short period of time. But do you have like a short takeaway? If somebody said in a couple of words, what's your book about? Who were Unruly Americans that had an impact on the origin of the Constitution? What would your takeaway be on that? What would you suggest to them?
I would say that if you love the Constitution, it's worth knowing that it wasn't always an underdog's constitution.
Mhm.
And by underdogs, I mean, looking out for the little guy. Really, that began with the Bill of Rights, with protections against unlawful search and seizure, and then continues with the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment civil rights for Black men, 15th Amendment voting rights for Black men, and finally the 19th, which gives women the right to vote as well. Those are what I would call underdog aspects of the Constitution, and they all came long after September 17, 1787. So the framers weren't there to write an underdog's constitution, almost the opposite of that. They were there to write an undemocratic constitution. But again, I would disagree with Charles Beard. They didn't do that to line their own pockets. They did that because they believed writing an underdog's constitution was the only way out of this terrible recession. But I think they were wrong. I think they were sincere but wrong, because I'm more attracted to this alternative explanation for the recession of the 1780s, which is the one that the farmers offered, which was that the government had taxed the economy into recession. So to put it in one sentence, there were two sides of the argument.
Super. Well, Woody, thanks so much for joining me today for another enjoyable interview. To our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with historian Woody Holton, author of Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution. Excellent book. And for those who are interested in really learning about the true origins of the Constitution, it's certainly an excellent book to include in that library. So my name is Randy Flood. Thank you again, Woody, for everything. I really appreciate talking to you today. And to our viewers and listeners, join us again next time for another exciting interview with an outstanding historian about the real American Revolution. So long for now.
Thanks, Randy.